Now I'll introduce our speaker for this morning, Paulo Ribeiro. His talk is Playing with the Past Using Games and Digital Technology to Teach History. Games and digital media offer new ways to depict and experience history. And Paulo, who's a gaming expert, will talk about how developers make immersive tools for historical experiences and how educators are leveraging these tools to teach the next generation.
So while I get this started, just talk a little bit about myself. So I've been a member here at the Society for 15 years now. It seems hard to believe that it's been that long. I've been an avid gamer all my life, or at least most of my life, and specifically with an interest in historical games. In 2018, I started at Teachers College, getting my master's in educational game design. Finished that up in 2020, just in time to be locked down with everybody else. So that gave me time to play even more games.
Joel, can you hear me? Can you make Paulo a
Yeah, everybody can hear. Oh, he needs to be the host.
Be a
Sorry.
So he's going to share. Yep.
Sorry about that. Here you go.
And so my talk today is actually inspired by a couple of things. One is I've been working on my own historical game recently based on the region of Brazil where my family comes from. And so I'll talk a little bit about that, but it's pretty early in development, so don't have a ton to say about it. But and also some games that I've been playing recently, which we'll talk about here. So share my screen. Okay. So, at this time in this country, we're certainly facing a moment where history has become quite controversial again. I mean, it never really was not controversial, but we're seeing a very big effort to sort of rewrite history and to erase the parts of history that we just don't like or that we think are inconvenient. And you see a lot of removal of books from school libraries, and you're seeing removal of curricula that discuss things that people don't want to talk about, such as slavery and genocide and things like that. And you're also seeing at the same time the rise of, particularly in gaming spaces, the alt-right. It doesn't get talked about so much, but we've seen a definite rise in extremism amongst the younger generation, men in particular, and in a lot of ways it's happening through these online game spaces, through the games, through the places where people are talking about games, like Discord, for example. I learned last night, for example, that the Unite the Right rally that happened in 2017 was planned through Discord, which is a major gaming communications platform. So, it just seemed like a really timely thing to talk about. So, depictions of society has been a part of games for as long as games have been around. I mean, something like chess, for example, now could sort of be considered a historical reenactment game, but when chess was first developed, it was not historical, it was what was going on. These were the battlefields they were actually fighting on, right? So the earliest forms of what we would call depicting history, as in something in the past, really came from the tabletop wargaming scene in the mid-20th century, right? Which in turn sort of started out with actual generals planning out military campaigns on, if you've ever seen sort of the stereotypical scene of them with little pieces on the board and they're moving them around on this giant map, that eventually became a gaming environment and people really got into that. And so a lot of times you'd see them doing reenactments of famous battles and things like that, which also in turn, that gaming scene then led to other things such as tabletop gaming or tabletop RPGs such as Dungeons and Dragons, right? So it went from being this thing we were doing this massive simulation with huge armies to small simulations where you have individual groups of people sort of going around and questing and being heroes and all that good stuff. So this was sort of my entry into, well, no, I guess that's not actually true. My entry into historical games was probably Oregon Trail, which many of you may have heard of. Very popular in schools. You know, it was one of those things where it maybe wasn't the most fun game, but it was the most fun game you were going to play in school. And it was a game where you started out as a family with your little covered wagon in Missouri, and you had to make your way across this new territory to Oregon, basically. And you know, it was a lot of fun as a kid, but you know, you also realize that it gave you very much only one half of the story, right? Because it basically completely left out, you know, the indigenous experience, which was very different from their angle. So that's, you know, sort of one of those examples where you start to really kind of critique these things. And I also really got into a video game series called Civilization, which Civilization is a game, the first game came out in 1989, I think, and in the game you start out as a little tribe in the year 4000 BC, and you have to basically expand and develop and, you know, build your technologies, and eventually you're making armies and conquering your enemies and things like that. And there was a whole bunch of games in this genre, both in the board game space and also in the digital space. And this is sort of what people would think about for a long time when they would talk about historical games, these types of games. You know, when you would talk about using games in a classroom, it would be these types of games that people would be talking about. But there is a lot of issues with these games, right? So one is that the very strong emphasis on war, conquest, and imperialism. It also depicts historical progress as very linear. So, you know, there is a technology tree, right? You research, you know, the wheel, and then that enables you to go to, you know, machinery, and then that enables you to go to the next thing, you know, and you know, or you might start with pottery, right? And then pottery allows you to make clay tablets, which lets you do writing, and that lets you do an alphabet, right? But that is a very narrow history of technology, right? I mean, technology just simply doesn't work that way, right? I mean, yes, the ancient Mesopotamians wrote on clay tablets, but the ancient Indians in South Asia would use palm leaves, right? I mean, one of the reasons why South Asian scripts is so flowy is the fact that if you try to write with straight lines on palm leaves, you're going to rip the palm leaves. So as a result, the language became very flowy as a result. You have the ancient Incans who didn't bother with a writing language at all, but had something called quipu, which were these knots tied with string, and you could encode incredible amounts of information using quipu. And it's only recently that we've actually been able to figure out how it worked. But there has been a lot of research lately, and we're now able to read it. And a lot of it is sort of keeping track of you know, goods and warehouses and things like that, and you know, sort of tabulating population sizes and stuff. It's very good for numbers, but they've also realized that there is actually history in those knots as well, and something that we didn't know until fairly recently. Civilization games don't bother with any of that stuff, right? I mean, they basically work under the assumption that you start out with your civilization looking a lot like a civilization in Mesopotamia, and then you progress a little bit, and now it looks a lot like a civilization in ancient Rome, and you progress a little further, and now it looks a lot like a civilization in medieval Europe, and then Renaissance, and then basically industrial North America, and then, you know, so you get to the point where you're building spaceships and stuff like that. And that is despite the fact that a lot of these games these days do a much better job at having playable civilizations from a wide variety of cultures, right? So modern civilization games, you know, you can play as the Aztecs, you can play as the Incas, you can play as, you know, the Haudenosaunee in you know, the Iroquois, you can play as Thai, and you know, they do a much better job of representing all of these cultures. But when you're actually playing the game, they still get railroaded into this very linear form of progression. So I want to talk briefly about the most overused setting or time period in games. So these are all basically action games or first-person shooter games, where it's a game where you're running around with a gun and you're seeing it entirely from your own perspective. You know, but what time period do you see being represented here? And this is like a tiny fraction of the games in this genre. Yeah, and so if you don't want to play first-person shooter, you can also, oh, there's a delay there. You can also be doing things like using U-boats and planes and other stuff like that. And these games are a lot of fun, but this is sort of the other idea of what a historical game is, right? Let's just recreate World War II endlessly, right? And these games also are the first games in their franchises. So there are multiple games of each one of these games that I'm covering here. So yeah, so this is definitely one of those time periods where there's just so many games that are talking about this, and for some understandable reasons, right? Because I found this meme the other day, which was something I thought about as a kid, and I was glad that I was not the only person who had this thought. It says, "World War II soldiers watching you play a video game about the worst day of their lives." But of course, video games did not start the tradition of turning World War II into a source of entertainment, right? Many of these World War II video games were drawing extremely heavily from the films that the game makers had seen, right? The first game that I showed there, Wolfenstein, was directly inspired by the Guns of Navarone. Many of those games also usually have some sort of scene where you start off the game at Normandy, and it looks very much like the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan. So we have a long tradition of sort of taking World War II and making it into something that is entertainment. But I think there is a big difference between a film or a TV series or something and a game, right? Because one of the things, of course, TV and films have a responsibility to depict these scenes with respect and with compassion and in a way that isn't sort of just exploiting these events, but they never ask you to be a participant, right? And that makes a big difference. And that was something I didn't really understand as a child, that me taking on this role is very different from me watching actors play this role, right? And so one of the examples is that a lot of these games that I've shown are online games where you play with other players, right? So you're on one team, and then there's another team there, right? And so one team is the Allies, and the other team is the Axis. And any trace of, we sort of think of World War II as, the good war. That's usually the term that people will use to describe it, right? Because you have these two sides where one is just so obviously evil, right? And the other side is so obviously not as evil. When I was a kid, it used to be the good side. And then as I got older, I said, well, it's the better of the two options side. But all that gets stripped out in these types of games, right? There's no depiction of swastikas. There's no depictions of the Holocaust, anything like that. The reason why there's no swastikas actually is not because of just not wanting to inject that into the game. It's actually because Germany will not allow that game to be published in Germany with swastikas. So they will usually end up using something like the Iron Cross or something like that as a stand-in when depicting the Axis players in this game, right? But in these environments, you're just a bunch of guys running around, blowing each other up, shooting each other, and then you're dead, and 2 seconds later, you're right back up again and going off. And it just strips out all the horror of war. It just strips out all of the horrors of World War II specifically, and all the things that made the war as devastating as it was. And yet this for a lot of us growing up, this was our idea of what history looked like, right? So it's just something to think about in terms of, when we make a game, we are inviting people to take on a role, and that can really impact, the ethical considerations of what we're asking of them, right? Does it ever make sense for people to play the bad guy in a game? To build a game where you have, where the player is expected to sort of be kind of the villain a little bit, or someone who's working for the villains. We'll go over an example of a game that's come out where you're kind of doing that. But yeah, I mean, the one, an educational game that I've thought of that I cannot make, but I kind of think should be made, is one that discusses redlining, but which is when non-white people were basically effectively excluded from moving into white neighborhoods through a series of policies. And it's a very complex issue that often gets simplified to the point that I think it becomes inaccurate on both sides. And I think it would be interesting to play a game where you are sort of the mastermind trying to do that. You're the one trying to do it. Because I looked at it from the other angle, and I just don't think that it really simulates the systems in a way that is necessarily the most useful. But, you know, again, it's a game where you would definitely be playing the bad guy. So one of the games where you're not playing the bad guy is one of the games that I've been playing recently, and actually was really what inspired me to do this talk today, which it's a game that my girlfriend and I have been playing called The Darkest Files. So all the characters in this game are fictional, with the exception of your boss in the game, Fritz Bauer. And so you are playing a woman prosecutor in 1952 West Germany, and you are basically trying to prosecute Nazi war crimes. And it's a very interesting game where you're actually pouring through these documents and interviewing people and reading transcripts and stuff like that, and trying to figure out who committed the crime. You're trying to figure out whether there was even a crime committed, right? One of the very unfortunate things about this time period in terms of prosecuting a lot of these crimes is that in a lot of cases, the West German government said, we can't prosecute these people because the crime they committed wasn't a crime when they committed it, right? So for example, the first scenario that you have is an old man who was arrested by the party because basically there was he pulled down the Nazi flag and put up a white flag as the Allied troops were approaching, basically to signal that the town was surrendering and that they weren't going to put up a fight. And so he was arrested by these party officials. They took him into a cell and shot him. And so the first thing you have to figure out is, can we even prosecute these people? Right? Now, under West German law in the 1950s, of course you could. But you can't apply West German law to something that happened under the Nazi regime. And so the first thing you have to figure out is, was this illegal even by the Nazis' very generous conditions for executing people, right? And eventually you find out that it was. And so then you have to figure out, based on that, okay, who was the one who actually pulled the trigger, who tried to stop this from happening, and then you have to go to trial and try to make your case. We did not do so well on the trial part. It's actually quite tricky to figure out how all the pieces fit together. It's a real detective game. The only character in the game who is a real person is Fritz Bauer, seen here. Everyone else is a completely fictional character based on real events. Fritz Bauer is interesting because one of the things that you notice as you're playing the game is that you, as this female prosecutor, has her parents keep kind of calling her and sending her letters, and they keep wanting to know more about what's going on in her life, and they express concerns about her being involved with this guy Fritz Bauer, and they sort of feel like, why are you making trouble? Why are you stirring up of the past? But they also start talking about how Fritz Bauer's got this really bad reputation for being a deviant, right? And this was interesting because this is a real person. So as things are going on, eventually I just went to Wikipedia to kind of get the full story. Fritz Bauer was actually arrested for being caught with another man. And so this was actually during the occupation. I think he was in Denmark at that point, and he was actually arrested there, managed to flee Europe, came back after the war, which also was a factor. A lot of people were pretty resentful towards him for having essentially run away and leaving them to live under Nazi rule. But it's just really interesting how they've incorporated this other aspect of into the game. That even while a lot of people feel like he's doing good work, they also sort of look at him as this other. Right? So another game that I've included here is a game called Detention. This game is a little bit more on the supernatural. It's definitely much more on the supernatural side. So that certainly is not historical. But it does take place during a real-time period in Taiwan in the 1960s under the military dictatorship there. And so that certainly forms an important backdrop for the game. And there's also lots of elements of Chinese culture that gets included in there as well. Another game that I played that was really, really interesting was called The Town of Light. So this one is set in Italy in 1938. It's got some light psychological horror elements. It never quite goes full-blown supernatural, I would say. It sort of jumps back and forth between this psychiatric hospital, which I believe is a real psychiatric hospital that is now abandoned today, and the setting in 1938 where you're following the story of this young woman who has a psychological disorder. And this game's been praised quite a bit for the fact that it depicts mental illness in a way that is respectful, but it also avoids stereotypes of psychiatric hospitals and psychiatric hospital staff, right? So, when we often think of, insane asylums or things like that, we think of, the horror movie setting where it's these people who are trying to torture the patients there, and it's, usually depicted in a way that makes it seem like this horrible place that, that you're sent to as punishment rather than a place where you're supposed to go to get better, right? And it certainly is not totally rosy there. There are a lot of issues, and certainly there is also the fact that some of the methods that they're using to try to cure this woman of her mental disorder, like shock therapy and things like that, are certainly not in use today, because they seem to be very traumatic. But you can also see that the doctors and nurses are trying. They're really making an effort to try to help this person. And despite that, of course, she sees it in a way that's very frightening for her, right? As you can see in this image here, she's struggling against the straitjacket. So it's a very nuanced game. It's very interesting. Highly recommend that one. More recent game, which is kind of not history, but has become history in the sense that time has gone on, is a game called Bury Me, My Love, which depicts a Syrian refugee trying to reach Europe. The game is told exclusively through her smartphone. So you're sort of seeing these text messages that are going back and forth between her and her lover back in Syria, and so he's trying to describing all the horrible things that are happening there, and she's describing her problems trying to get, essentially sneak into Europe and all of the confrontations that she's having there. And so it's a multiple choice game. You'll get these options where you can pick one choice or another, and that will have some impact on how the story actually plays out. And there are multiple different endings. So yeah, so this is, maybe more of a social studies game rather than a history game, but definitely very interesting. This one is called 1979 Revolution Black Friday. So fairly timely given recent events. I actually, when I was at Teachers College, got to meet the creator of this game. He came to talk at one of our classes. He's based out of Brooklyn. And so he's actually a refugee from Iran, left after the 1979 revolution. And so this game is a single-player game where you are a photojournalist walking around, taking pictures, and interacting with people, and kind of getting to explore the events immediately around the Iranian Revolution, in particular an event called Black Friday, which was where the Shah's secret police basically massacred a whole bunch of people. A little bit of a lighter game, much lighter game really than some of the ones I've discussed, is this game called Romanizer, which my decision to include this one was actually just very interesting timing. I happened to be listening to a Great Courses Plus course that was talking about ancient religion and mythology and stuff like that, and there was a whole lecture that was specifically around this Anatolian goddess named Cybele, and literally days after I listened to that lecture, I found out about this game where the whole goal of the game is to try to convince the Roman public to adopt Cybele into their pantheon. Now, one of the things I think is left out of the game, I haven't actually played the game myself at this point, but one of the interesting things that was sort of left out of the game that was talked about in the lecture was that Cybele originally, even though she's sort of a maternal goddess, is very much a wild goddess, a goddess of fury, if you will. And by the time she actually makes it into the Roman pantheon, she has been very heavily defanged. She is much more the passive, motherly type, and so I don't know that that's actually depicted here in this game, but you're essentially trying to convince the Roman people to get on board with including her. And you can see there's some resistance. This guy says, these Oriental cults are corrupting our city. Cybele only brings chaos and dereliction. So games that teach history also don't necessarily need to represent real historical moments in time, but they can be used to teach historical concepts as well. So if they simulate real social systems in a very accurate way, that could be one situation. If they depict real methodologies for historical research, that's another way in which they can be valuable. So one of the examples, this was sort of the example I was giving of kind of also being a little bit of the bad guy, is a game called Papers, Please, in which you are a border guard in a fictional communist country in the 80s, and your whole job is to try to figure out who can you let in, who do you have to reject, right? And so it involves going through their paperwork and checking their photo IDs against each other, and also they have a body scan thing they do at a certain point. And also every single day, your government is putting out these new regulations, right? We're on bad terms with country B today, so don't let any of them in, and then tomorrow, country B is fine, country A is now the problem, or we don't want people who have less than $50 in their pocket, whatever. There's always just new regulations coming out that you constantly have to be abiding by. And so you might just think to yourself, why don't I just green light everybody? Why don't I just let everybody in? And the reality is, the other component to the game is that you have a family to take care of. You have a daily payout that you get depending on who you let in and whether or not they sort of fit with the government's regulations. And so if they're found to have, if you're found to have been violating those regulations, you'll be penalized for that. And so you really have this very fine balancing act where you are trying to keep your family alive, but also not just sort of turn everybody away either. There's also a similar sort of game called Beholder, which you are essentially, I think it's probably based off of the movie Other People's Lives, if anybody's ever heard of that one. It's about the Stasi in East Germany. And so it's basically about eavesdropping on people using wiretaps. And so that's a game where you're trying to find the dissidents in your society and report them, right? So that's another example of a game where you're playing the bad guy, and but by doing so, it sort of raises these ethical issues. So another game, it's real long lag. So another game that has to do with warfare is a game called This War of Mine, except it's very different from the typical war games that you see out there in that you are playing from the perspective of the civilians, the people who have to live through the war. And the country in the game is fictional, but the type of experiences that these people are going through, trying to survive day to day, very much based on real events and real struggles that people have. The game series has been so widely popular. In fact, the video game has been so widely popular that it now actually has a board game version of it. So very interesting, very grim, certainly not a fun game to play, but one that definitely gives you some idea of the kind of struggles that people have to go through in order to survive in a war zone. So this game, Heaven's Vault, really interesting game. If you're a language person, you probably would want to give this one a shot. This is set in a very fantastical world. It is not at all grounded in reality. But the way in which you play the game is very much sort of has a methodology to it that is relatable to real history, which is that you are trying to decipher an ancient language, and it's a pictographic language, so each symbol that you see represents a different idea, and so these pictographs will also sometimes be built off of each other, and so you'll figure out that, okay, this is the symbol for water, right? And then there's like another symbol here, and I haven't seen that one before, so maybe that means ocean, So you're gradually trying to piece together this language, and there's a really great system for helping you make sure that after you've seen the symbol in a certain number of contexts, it will then permanently be established that this is the correct meaning of that word, so you're not constantly guessing throughout the whole course of the game, did I pick the right word for this? But also one of the other things that I like about this game is that you aren't just looking at an ancient civilization as a single snapshot. It's very clear that this is a civilization that has existed for thousands of years, and when you go to these different locations, you are looking at it at a different period of time with different political systems and different societies, and you're sort of piecing together that history as you're going along, and it's this layered type of experience that I think is really interesting. So that's definitely a game worth checking out. But then also so moving away from talking about sort of specific games, there are sort of technologies that we're seeing being used to sort of shape people's ideas about history a little bit more. So one example here is the game Pokemon Go, which I'm sure probably everyone here has heard of Pokemon Go, but in case you haven't, Pokemon Go is a game where you're catching Pokemon, which are these little creatures. It's a Nintendo intellectual property, and so you're walking around to different locations in the real physical world with your mobile phone and interacting with these different locations. In fact, this building is also a Pokestop in Pokemon Go. So if you opened up Pokemon Go right now, you will see this building in there. But one of the things that the company Niantic that owns Pokemon Go did a number of years ago was give people the opportunity to nominate locations to be landmarks in the game. And they did insist that it have to have some kind of cultural or historical value or something like that. You couldn't just say, well, I don't feel like getting out of bed, so I'd like to have a Pokestop right in my house, right? So you had to nominate something that actually had some sort of cultural value. And I will say from personal experience, I've discovered all of these little really interesting places that don't necessarily have a lot to indicate that something interesting happened there, or so that there's something interesting there, right? For example, in my town where I used to live in Ridgefield Park, somebody built a weird robot sculpture. It's just out in front of a building somewhere. This is this weird robot, but it for some reason became a landmark in Pokemon Go. And I remember walking over to it, and it's just this weird, funny-looking robot sculpture that's been there for years. Why is it there? I don't know. I'm sure there's a story behind it. I'm sure someone could tell me about it. But it's something I probably wouldn't have ever stumbled across if I hadn't seen it on the map in the game and then decided to walk over there and interact with it. I think that things like this could also be potentially very useful to kind of expand upon places that have maybe not been given. I mean, this was something I wrote about actually back in 2020 when the George Floyd protests were happening. We were seeing a lot of discussion around removal of monuments, some of which ended up being removed, a number of which weren't. And I thought, this would be this could potentially be the kind of technology that could really allow for adding context to various landmarks. One of my students, so I do teach an XR game development class at Teachers College, and so one of my students this semester was working on exactly this thing. She created a GPS game where you'd be able to go and look at a historical monument, and it would pop up with all of these interesting facts and details to tell you a little bit about it. And so that can also be the kind of thing that would share with you some information about a landmark that you wouldn't have otherwise known. Or it can also be a way to create a landmark where maybe there isn't one, where you think someone should know what happened here. And there's no plaque, there's no statue, there's nothing like that. But I can, without getting any permits, without getting any approval from anybody, I can create a game that will let people stand in this spot and know what happened here, right? So in terms of actually making your own games, which is something that some educators do decide to do. Certainly a lot of people in my program, obviously, were very interested in making their own games. There are sort of three really big players in the game engine space. So one of the reasons why there are so many new and interesting games, and it's not just World War II recycled, is the fact that game development has very much become democratized in the last few years. So you don't have to build your own game engine from scratch. You can use one of the ones that are already out there. The first one is an open source, free open source game engine. So you can download this, make a game, and publish it wherever you want, and you owe them nothing. The other two are much more powerful game engines and much more popular within commercial game spaces, but you do have to pay based on the amount of money. That if you don't generate any revenue from these games, you don't have to pay anything, but if you do generate revenue, you will have to give them a percentage of that. So Godot is free, open source. Unreal Engine and Unity are free to use, but not open source, and you do have to pay somewhere down the line if you make any money. So another great space for getting to participate in the creation of historical games. This is from a website called itch.io, which basically they will host a number of different what's called game jams, which are, if you ever heard of a hackathon, it's the same sort of idea. You get a span of time where you're able to make a game and put it out for the world, and you can work as an individual, you can work in teams. I've participated in a number of these, and it's always a lot of fun. The games are, given the fact that you have 48 hours a week sometimes, the games are very, very simple. Usually not a lot of, impressive graphics or anything like that, but people come up with incredibly creative things, and it's always a great time. Another event I participated in back in 2021, which was the Cultural Heritage Game Jam. So this was actually an interesting one because this was the Historically Accurate Game Jam is kind of just a community event where everyone just signs up and then they submit their games, and that's pretty much it. And I think they may have a team that picks a winner. But the Cultural Heritage Game Jam was actually partnered with the U.S. State Department and an organization called Global Game Jam. And so this one was specifically about trying to create games that focus on the preservation of cultural heritage. It also included highlighting issues related to theft and destruction of cultural heritage, and the return of stolen heritage items back, repatriating them to the countries of origin or to the people who they were stolen from. One of the really interesting things about this particular game jam is that it wasn't just about making the games. They also, 24 hours a day, were running different activities, and they had a number of talks by people from the State Department who were working in the Cultural Antiquities Task Force that was responsible for repatriating a lot of these items. And so you really got to, you as the game developer also got to learn a lot about what was going on. They also had experts who would talk to the game developers and sort of get an idea of like, well, okay, what's the game you're designing? What's the direction you want to go in with it? And then they'd say, okay, well, maybe that doesn't make sense. You might want to try something different. So you really got a lot of feedback from people who are actually experts in this field for the game developers, which is a really nice resource. I'd like to see more stuff like this happen. Unfortunately, it will not be with the State Department because the State Department has closed all of this. So this was the only year that this particular event ran, but the whole cultural heritage unit has been shut down as of, yeah. So if you go on the website, it says May 2025 is the last update, and it's just an archive at this point. So there will be nothing like that more coming from them. But I would be very interested to see other organizations doing things maybe around education. There is actually a climate one that happens where they bring in climate experts who will talk to the game developers and just the audience in general and provide feedback in that way. So it gives an opportunity to come up with much more scientifically accurate depictions of climate issues in games. Another thing has also helped democratize the making of games, or just the number of free resources for graphic design out there. So you have vector graphics and layout with a program called Inkscape. You have photo editing and illustrations with a program called GIMP. Blender is a game that allows for 3D modeling. Krita is for digital painting. And so these are used not just by amateurs, but also by people in the industry as well. I didn't include a slide here as well. I realized I had forgotten that. But another issue is also the topic of game modding, which game modding is actually how I first got into making games, which is you are not creating your own game, you're taking an existing game and then modifying it, essentially. And so some game developers will have incredibly powerful toolkits that they'll release along with their game that'll allow people to edit all sorts of things about the game and sometimes create completely new functionality in ways that the game works. This is, of course, a double-edged sword because it is open to everyone to make mods, and sometimes people make mods that are not so great, right? So, for example, The Sims, some of you may have heard of, is a game where you get to play, where you get to actually kind of like watch characters living out their daily lives and doing all their activities. Immensely popular game. Recently, there was a major controversy because somebody released a mod that just strips all the people of color out of the game. So it's a European phenotype mod is what the term that usually will get used when you're trying to essentially say, we've removed all of our people of color from this game. Here's the mod for that, right? And of course, when they get pushback from it, then they will say, well, if you don't like it, just don't download it, right? Don't install it. It's your choice. You don't have to use this. Stop getting offended, right? We've seen other examples of that in historical games as well. I was reading yesterday about one for a game called Europa Universalis, which is about, or essentially you're a European country and in the Renaissance era, and this particular mod is all about essentially stopping Islam. Like that's the whole plot of the game, right? And so, the developers of the game are just sort of like, well, this is just an alternate history thing, but it's pretty clear from a lot of the followers of the game that this is a fantasy that they want to live out, not just like a interesting what if scenario, right? So modding is definitely very much a double-edged sword. You can get some really great stuff coming out by really dedicated people who are creating something that is actually educational, and then you can just get a new form of hate speech. So another important area of games is also tabletop RPGs. So tabletop RPG, we talked a little bit about in the beginning, examples like Dungeons and Dragons. So this is a game that is run by a game master or a dungeon master. So this is a person who is essentially structuring the game and kind of setting, instead of having a computer doing all of the story development type stuff, or you have a person basically doing that, and you get, as a result, much richer and more detailed experiences from that. And in a lot of ways, it's a discussion between the players and the GM to sort of shape the story. Usually also involves some kind of randomization or a non-determined aspect of some sort. So that could be dice, it could be tarot cards, it could be playing cards. I've even seen people use Jenga towers. So if you have to try to accomplish a task, you pull out a Jenga piece, and if it all falls over, you've failed the task, and then there will be some sort of consequence that will come from that. So there are definitely historical examples of that. One, this is not a historical work at all, but so I'm holding up right now for those of you on Zoom a book called The Corio Hall Adventures, which is a expansion for Dungeons and Dragons. So this is specifically based on Korean culture and mythology. This was kickstarted a number of years ago on Kickstarter crowdfunding website. And the guy who created this is actually not himself Korean. I think he's Estonian, but he's lived in Korea for a number of years. And when the South Korean government found out about this book, they actually were so excited that they ended up giving him a big chunk of money so that he could subsidize the shipping, so that he was able to send out the books all across the world. So, South Korea was very interested in this as sort of their sort of cultural diplomacy, their soft power, if you will. So even though it's set in a fantasy world, a lot of it comes out of real Korean cultural traditions and folklore and stuff like that. Another form of role play that you will see is what's called live action role play. And so live action role play is something where you're actually dressing up in costumes and acting out these different roles. It is similar to, or can be if it's a historical setting, similar to something like a historical reenactment, except the main difference is that in a historical reenactment, you're just trying to recreate the event as it happened, whereas in a LARP, there's much more freedom you know, if you go to a Civil War battle, you know, if you go to the Battle of Gettysburg, you know, the Union's going to win every time. If it's a reenactment, you're not going to suddenly get this weird situation where it turns out differently. But in a LARP, you know, they may do, you know, I think there was one at a game convention I saw a few years ago, which was sort of recreating the American Revolution, and so people split up into British side and American side, and they sort of got to make the decisions to really affect the outcome. But everybody was dressed up in these costumes, and it was really, you know, interesting experience. So then there's also theater games, which, you know, it's not something we necessarily think about as being really games, but one that I became very interested in with a number of years ago was called Theater of the Oppressed. I've had the opportunity to see some performances of that too, and it's very interesting. So this was developed by the Brazilian dramatist and activist Augusto Boal in the 1970s. He tells a famous story about how he first came up with this idea, and basically it started because in the 1950s and 60s he was going around with a troupe of actors to sort of encourage the laborers on plantations in Brazil to rise up, and, you know, mainly they wanted better treatment, but they also wanted to have actual control of the land themselves. And so, just full disclosure, my family were plantation owners, so my family was on the other side of that issue. So very, very much before my time. But so he did these performances, you know, for these workers, and you know, and of course they would usually have guns and things like that, and they would say, we're rising up and, you know, overthrowing the oppressors and things like that. And so the workers came up to him and said, oh, you know, we've got some extra guns here. You know, if you want to come with us over to the house, and we'll just go take over right now. And and he said, no. He said, no, I'm just an actor. I'm not a fighter. And they said, oh, so when you were talking about giving our lives, you meant our lives, not yours. And that was the wake-up call for him. And he said, okay, you know what? Let's create a new form of theater where people who actually are the oppressed people get to be the actors and get to come up on stage and tell people their story. And so what what that means then is that the audience members then become spectators, as they call it. And so one of the features of this that sort of makes it a much more interactive experience is that when the play is over, the audience members are invited to come up, don the costumes that the people on stage were wearing, and try to reenact the scenario as they would have done it to try to solve the problems themselves, right? And then that'll be the point where the actors can say, well, no, that's not realistic. You can't do that. That wouldn't work that way, you know. And they get to kind of show how these problems are not the fault of individual choices; they're the fault of systemic problems, right? So in 2018, when I first started at Teachers College, I had the opportunity to take Theater of the Oppressed and apply it into a digital setting. And so one of the things I worked on with one of my classmates, this was still when I was very new at using Unity, and so, I mean, he was slightly less new, so he did most of the actual coding stuff. But there's an online communication tool called VR Chat, which allows people to put on VR headsets and interact with each other in 3D settings. They also have essentially a modding kit that you can use Unity to create your own environments and to sort of set up your own scenarios. And so we used that to create an environment that would simulate the Theater of the Oppressed experience for people, and you know, sort of allow people to tell their stories and also then allow other people to take on those roles. So one of our goals when we were thinking about this would be to allow policymakers to step into the shoes of stakeholders and to really hear the stakeholders' story from their own mouths. So some of the affordances of VR chat is something called the Proteus effect, which is something that has been studied that when people take on an avatar in a game setting, whether it's virtual reality or just you know, through a computer, they more easily identify with that character and with that character's story and experience. And so we wanted to leverage that a little bit. And you know, we also thought that this could be very useful for remote settings, right? So audiences and actors who are maybe separated from each other, you know, such as prisons, immigration detention centers, isolated areas, things like that. Somebody should, power through this. So in terms of board games, there's also been a lot, you know, again, board games used to be one of those areas where it was all civilization building and conquest and imperialism and all that good stuff. But you are seeing a lot more now of trying to have games that tell the different types of stories. So this one is called Freedom, the Underground Railroad, where you are working together as a team to try to help as many people escape from slavery as possible. This is another game that I'm holding up here now. It's called Cangaceiros, which takes place in northeastern Brazil, where my family is from, in the 1930s. So this is basically the Cangaceiros were groups of bandits, essentially. They were either terrorists or freedom fighters, depending on depending on which side of the issue you were on. And so in this game, this is a competitive game. You're playing against each other, but you are essentially taking on different teams of Cangaceiros, sort of fighting against the government in this region. Another thing that is also in the board game space is something called print and play games. So this is a great way, because board games are fairly costly to produce, and also because there is a lot of logistics issues in board games. I mean, the board game industry is in serious trouble right now because the overwhelming majority of board games are printed in China. And so because of all the tariff issues, the board game industry has more or less ground to a halt, and they're currently, there's a class action lawsuit by board game developers against the Trump administration over the tariffs issue. Right. But one of the ways you can get around all this stuff is by having what's called print and play games. And so these are games that are essentially PDFs that you can download online and allow you to print out the game and make the game pieces yourself. And so usually for a print and play game, you want to make sure you have some version of it where it's good for black and white printing. Players may need to also supply their own dice, card sleeves, standard deck of cards or something like that. But this is also sort of really interesting space, and also something that's potentially very useful for educators, where they don't have to necessarily go out and buy a big expensive game. They can just download the files and print it out, just run it off on the Xerox machine. So this is an example here of a game called Tiny Cold War, where you sort of run through the Cold War experience, and all the pieces have been printed out. Some people get very crazy with their prints. It is intended to be very accessible, but some people will go absolutely to the nines and come up with incredible printings that they do themselves and make all the game pieces themselves and 3D print pieces and stuff. That's not necessary. You don't need that for these types of games. This is also an interesting resource. This is Zach Hartzman. He's a guy who went to Teachers College a couple years before me. So he has actually put together a number of excellent resources on teaching using digital games. So he has all of these lesson plans and printouts, dittos, and things like that you essentially would use to play the game in class, and then sort of do these worksheets and run through these lesson plans that kind of add an additional layer of educational value on top of them. And then I just wanted to close on this one I found yesterday, which was really interesting, which is this is sort of a game as a postcard. So this is another print and play game that you can actually just print it out and then just send it as a postcard. And the person receiving it can can play it. There is also another example here, which is this card that is a professionally printed card. This one I ordered from a company. It's made by a woman in the UK. She makes a whole bunch of these, and so I ordered a bunch of them online. And it's really interesting. I sent one of them to a friend of mine. She had a great time with it. But it's just a game and a card. It's usually some sort of little logic puzzle game, but yeah, it's quite a lot of fun. I was sort of thinking as I looked at this postcard idea, what if I remember last year we were sending out postcards to remind people to vote from the society here. We were doing that as one of our activities. And I was thinking, wouldn't it be interesting if we developed like a little simple game that you could just send as a postcard, right? A word search or something like that, a crossword puzzle, something. Then it might just be something people would actually do rather than just chuck in the trash. And lastly, I just wanted to briefly touch on the idea of game preservation, so games as history rather than games depicting history, which is that, with all these game jams and other things like that we've talked about in these small games, these are things that are out there in the world, but they are very ephemeral a lot of times. A lot of these game jam games, people don't really continue developing them after they've made them. Sometimes they do, a lot of times they don't, and so the games may be a little bit broken. And they're hosted on these web servers, but those servers won't be around forever. Eventually they will go away. Board games will go out of print, and then it becomes very difficult to find copies of the games. You look on eBay, and they go for hundreds and hundreds of dollars. So there's always this struggle to try to keep this stuff available for people in any way that we can. And particularly if it has some sort of educational value, it is important that we do what we can to try to preserve them and make it so that they, in some form, remain available for people. So that's pretty much all I've got. So I think, thank you, everyone. I hope I didn't overload you.
Do you have time for questions?
I'm happy to take some questions. I don't know if we're... okay, I saw David had his hand up first, I think, in the back.
Get the microphone. Of course, test. Oh, good. Questions, not comments, and...
Thanks. Yeah, there's a podcast called Historically Thinking, and he has had several episodes on using the historical games specifically in pedagogical settings. And one of the guys was a professor at Columbia. I've forgotten his name. So I wonder if you could talk more about that and whether that, especially among younger faculty members, is that becoming more popular, doing that?
I mean, I certainly saw it in my program, but my program was also specifically around game design. So I don't know really, I haven't seen it too much. I mean, my day job is working at Columbia Engineering, and so I do work with the professors a little bit there. I haven't really seen any of them using games necessarily, but it's certainly something that could be used and probably should be used more.
I know we're also taking some from Zoom. I see Richard Askin has one up, and Joel, did you want to say something, or you have a question? All right, we'll go with Joel, and then Rich.
I'm gonna grab some water.
Rich is
Unmute
first.
yourself.
Rich is first.
Oh,
Yeah, that's
thank you,
first.
Joel. Either way is fine with me. Very interesting talk. I'm amazed how much you know about all these different games that I had no clue were out there. I'm actually, among other things I'm doing on my computer, I'm playing, I don't know whether it's Civ 4 or Civ 5 right now. The thing that was very interesting that you said was about the technology tree. I didn't realize that it was, I guess so, one-directional or so simplistic. And I'm wondering if you think that it could be improved to make the game more realistic.
Yes, that's a good question. So it is, yeah. So it's not completely linear in that it is not every single technology has, it's all just one line and you just research the next one in the line. It is a tree, so you get to pick which technology you want to research next, but it is very much based on the idea that there is a specific technology that is a prerequisite for this other technology, and you can't research that without first doing this, right? And the reality is just that, except in extreme cases, right? Like, certainly as we get more towards, modern day, you probably can't have space flight without rocketry, right? Like that's, there are physical limitations that might mean you have one technology that precedes another. But certainly in civilization, there's a lot more room for, either or options. You could do this or you could do that, and it will produce these different results. But it also is a question of that maybe you don't need to research certain technologies, right? Like the idea of civilization is you eventually want to fill out the entire tech tree. You want to research everything that there's to research. And many civilizations in the real world didn't do that. They just bypassed certain things and went on, they didn't even need to go that middle step. They just went right around it to the next thing, right? So that would be the way. I mean, I don't know how to balance that to make it, not something easily exploitable by the players. That's a whole other question. But I think there's a lot of room for making it work better.
Joel, and then we'll go back to the room.
All right. So I promise there's a question, but I do want to first just give a compliment that, there's that maybe idiom of find what makes you come alive, right? And this makes you a gift to the world, Paulo. It's just amazing that you love this stuff so much, and it's clear, and you're just luminous when you talk about it. It's wonderful. So thank you so much, and for all this information that so many of us have no exposure to. So that's actually the nature of my question. If we want to learn more, where do we go? I'm actually familiar with this boardgamegeek.com, which is amazing. It's like I want a categorical database for everything in my life like this. So it talks about every board game and how, popular it is, and what if it has a certain cultural influence, and like it's just amazing. I'm like, I want this for music, I want this for art, I want this for everything, but this is the only thing I know about boardgamegeek.com. So I'm asking you, where do you start with like more like the other kinds of games that you mentioned? Like if I want to learn more, where would you send your friends who are like, I don't know anything about this, please help me start to learn about it?
Yeah, so
Besides calling you.
yeah, so Board Game Geek definitely is a great resource. I used it for some of the stuff that I showed here with regards to the board games. It's also, Board Game Geek is also great too, because there is a researcher at NYU named Jeffrey Engelstein, who has sort of come up with a comprehensive list of board game mechanics that has undergone some level of rigor, and now Board Game Geek uses that as their official listing to break out all the games. So there's some level of academic seal of approval on the way they organize stuff on Board Game Geek. That's nice. I would say in terms of digital games, if you want to find out about independent games, itch.io that I mentioned was a really great resource. I went in there and just started randomly typing in different historical events, right? Like I looked up, the French Revolution, I looked up Russian Revolution. I even picked some more obscure things like the Battle of Blair Mountain. And so there actually were games for all of those things. Some of them didn't function very well, but they were there. Somebody had decided that was a topic they wanted to make a game about. And surprisingly large number of games about the 1932 Australian Emu War. So for those of you who don't know, in 1932 Australia tried to massively curb its emu population and failed miserably, but it did involve them using actual machine guns on the emu, and they failed. They failed to do what they were trying to do. So it got dubbed in the press the Emu War, but there are a ton of games about it now. So yeah, itch.io is a great resource. In terms of looking for commercial games, I use the Steam Marketplace to look for things, see what's out there currently. They have a lot of different tags that you can use. So when I was researching this, I kind of just went and just typed in historical into the search bar, and there was a tag for that, and then I just sort of looked through the top couple hundred games that came up. So that would be one place.
Jim?
I have to congratulate you, Paulo. You have kept the rapt attention of a guy who does not play games, ever, of any sort. My question is, could a game be developed about the anti-Vietnam War movement? I was part of a movement that really tried to go into the service and then disrupt it and bring an end to it. A friend of ours actually convinced his whole platoon not to go to Vietnam. He wound up in the stockade, of course. But there's a rich literature about this. One book is called They Fought Back. And I think since you've talked about Gettysburg and other war games, this might be an interesting field to look into.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. One of the games that I stumbled across on itch.io when I was researching this from one of the historically accurate game jams was the Tet Offensive. And so kind of, that was definitely much more of a kind of, it's themed around the Tet Offensive, but doesn't really teach you much about the consequences of it and how it impacted Americans' perceptions of the war. So this is actually one of the areas where I really feel like there's a massive gap. Is in this space of making a game that really gets you in the weeds on social action and civil resistance and other stuff like that. It's all, it tends to be very, sort of very abstracted, very surface level. And I would really like to see something that kind of delves much more deeply into that. I actually was playing a game with my girlfriend and some friends called Schedule 1, which is all about being a drug dealer. So not at all about civil resistance, but you do have all these like sort of negative interactions with the cops and things like that. And I was finding myself much more interested in that aspect of the gameplay than I was in the drug production. And I was kind of thinking, I really want a game that where I'm doing this, but running around the city and doing all this sort of stuff. But I'd rather it be about sort of taking on these institutional power structures and stuff like that. So I do feel like there's just not really any games out there that really get into the meat on that. One game that I saw that I was kind of interested in recently, that a YouTuber that I like was playing, is called Liberal Crime Squad, which is a text-based game that is an open source game. And I thought maybe that would be sort of the thing that I was looking for, but it's really not. It's much more there's a lot more combat in it. And you're trying to do things like raid animal testing facilities and nuclear power plants and right-wing compounds and stuff like that. But it's really much more about fighting. There's some stuff about publishing articles to sway public opinion and stuff, but it's much more about the combat. And I just did not really think that was really fitting what I want.
Matt?
Yeah, so thank you again for your talk. So I'm actually a high school history teacher. Is there one big hub of free resources, be they video games or board games and stuff related to history, that you would recommend? Because the big problem with me as a teacher is finding good resources that are free and reproducible, so every student can play them. Sometimes I'll find good resources, but then it's $50 or $60, and I'm I really want to spend that for one lesson. And I have, but it would be nice if there were some more free ones that are actually good. So are there any you would recommend?
Yeah, so that Zach Hartzman, who I talked about before, his Hey Listen Games website, I think that's really good. If you can, the games themselves are, generally speaking, commercial games, but the resources on his website, the supplementary resources are free, I believe. So that's a good resource I would recommend. Another thing I would recommend is something called iCivics, which was it's a nonprofit that was started in part with Sandra Day O'Connor, and so they have a whole bunch of games on there that there are some historical games, but it's more focused on government and civics, and so they've got some great resources there. I would definitely recommend them, and I think all the games there are free, so you can just play those. It's just a question of having a computer for the students to be able to play that on. Yeah, it is tough, when you've got a classroom full of kids finding games that they can all do at the same time. There is a genre of board game called roll and write games, which are games where one person is sort of kind of rolling dice or something like that, and then everybody has a little score sheet in front of them, and they're making decisions, trying to optimize the dice rolls in the best way possible for them. That is one of the few games where you can kind of play with an infinite number of people. It's a nice alternative to something like just bingo, which is kind of mindless, frankly. That might be. I can't think of any specifically historical roll and write games, but that might be another venue.
Is there any more questions online? No? We'll take one more in the room. All right, Dan?
Yeah, so I was thinking in some ways parallel to what Jim White was referring to, but in a very different context. I would think that things like union organizing drives or civil rights struggles or any of those sort of from the ground up kinds of things could be a very rich area for developing games, especially because there's randomness in the sense that you don't know what's going to happen when you develop a certain strategy. And so do you know if anyone has tried to explore those kinds of things, simulating local organizing for a cause? And if not, do you see, well, I think you probably would see a space of that sort of thing. But given the need for improvisation and those kinds of activities, and as I say, the fact that there's randomness in them, I think that would be a golden opportunity for creating games that were both interesting to play and very educational in terms of what's involved in those kinds of things.
Yeah, and as I said, I think there is a gap in those. I mean, I think that there are a lot of games sort of around those themes. For example, there's a game called Mafia 3, which is the third in the Mafia series. But it's a game that takes place in the 1960s in the South, and one of the characters you are playing as is a but you're gangsters in that game, right? And so you're a black gangster, and so you get to see a lot of, the issues around segregation there, but it's not really reflected in terms of the gameplay and what you're doing. And when I do see games that are sort of where you're taking on the role of an organizer, they usually tend to be very simple games where it's kind of, you get a dialogue tree and it says, okay, pick one of 3 options here, and then, it's much more on the rails. It's a much more linear experience. There might be some variation, but I would like to see something that's much more systems driven, that there's really all these systems at play, and you have to try to balance them out. That game I mentioned, Liberal Crime Squad, had some interesting things in it where you did have to be very concerned about defections within your group, right? So if somebody got arrested, you had to be worried that they were going to flip and inform on you, and then all your people would get arrested and stuff like that. For no particular reason, I've been very interested in the subject of civil resistance lately. And I've been doing a lot more reading about it and a lot more understanding of, specific terminologies and sort of the academic structure of people's thinking about this, and that is for example, there's Gene Sharp, who's a researcher on this, produced this 198 civil resistance methods. I don't think they're all great. I think some of them are kind of repeat each other or just slightly different variations on others. But I think something like that is great for games because games are all about rules, right? And so in order to have those rules, you need these nice structured things. You can say, okay, we have here, protest. We have here sit-in. We have here, walkouts. We have, all these, these different boycotts, stuff like that, right? So if you have this nice structured list of things, it becomes a lot easier to build the game mechanics on those things, right? And so this is something I've become much more interested in. Okay, how would we represent, a stay-at-home strike, for example, something like that. And so I think there's a lot more space for people to make games that simulate those types of things in a very deep and rich way.
Well, thank you again, Paulo.
To learn more about us, visit our website, ethicalfocus.org, or email us at admin@ethicalfocus.org, and we'll get back to you. To make a donation, go to ethicalfocus.org/donate. Please follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and you can watch many of our past programs on our YouTube channel.